Now, their commentaries on areas that are open to ijtihaad are considered to be mawquf upon them. However, their opinions carry more weight than those of others. But it doesn't mean that their opinions must be accepted across the board. I may be opening myself up to attacks here, but let me go on to explain some of this. Ibn Abbas, for instance, he contradicted the consensus of the rest of the Sahaba in some of his ijtihaad on points of inheritance. In his interpretation of passages in those verses of inheritance in Surah An-Nisa, he interpreted them, some of those points, in ways in which he disagreed with all the rest of the Sahaba. Now, another Ibn Abbas explanation of a passage that some scholars accepted but most didn't, in the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 102, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واتبعوا ما تتلو الشياطين على ملك سليمان وما كفر سليمان ولكن الشياطين كفروا يعلمون الناس السحر وما أنزل على الملكين ببابل هاروت وماروت. This is talking about people from the Bani Israel who turned their back on revelation. And they followed instead, the verse begins, and they followed instead what the devils falsely related against the kingdom of Solomon. Because, they had all these ideas that Solomon was, he worked magic. And this is still there in the Masonic teachings, which are supposedly derived from Talmudic explanations. Anyway, they follow what the devils falsely related against the kingdom of Solomon. Solomon did not disbelieve, but the devils disbelieved, teaching mankind magic and what was revealed to the two angels in Babel, Harut and Marut. The passage goes on to say, I didn't read it in Arabic, but the two of them did not teach it to anyone until they had said, "We are only a trial, a fitna, so do not disbelieve by practicing magic." Now, this translation, which is Pickthall's, but it's also the Sahih International, and most translations that you read are going to agree with this translation, that the word وَمَا أُنزِلَ عَلَى الْمَلَكَيْنِ, that the ma in that passage means what? In other words, it's ma al-mawsool, whereas Ibn Abbas, he said it's ma al-nafiya. In other words, that magic was not sent down to the two angels in Babel. And At-Tabari accepted this, and so then, Harut and Marut, who are Harut and Marut? He said there are two men in Babel, and it causes a lot of problems with the coherence of the passage. And so, like Ibn Kathir, when he mentions Ibn Abbas's explanation, then he mentions Tabari's acceptance of it, and then he said this وَهَذَا بَعِيد. This is far-fetched. It's hard to accept. Anyway, be that as it may, let's move on. I referred earlier to knowledge of natural history, which in our terms we call it science. Ibn Abbas was asked about verses which would seem to indicate that the heavens were created first, after the earth, and then others which would seem to indicate that the earth was created first and the heavens. And so he explained that to mean that the earth was created first and then the heavens. And I don't want to go into a long discussion about it, but it's just pretty unlikely. The scientific consensus on that is that the heavens were created first. Estimations about the age of the universe vary markedly, but somewhere around 10 billion years. Carbon dating of the rocks on the Earth puts it about 4.5 billion. The Earth is part of the solar system. The Earth revolves around the sun. There are other planets which also revolve around the sun. To think that the Earth was just out there and then the whole universe was created and then somehow the Earth finds its place in this one solar system that's all created around it and then it starts whirling. It's a bit far-fetched. And Allah knows best. There's lots more scientific evidence for the position that the Earth was created after the other things, but we don't really have time to go into that. Now, regarding the tafsir of the Sahaba, people among the Sahaba, the major mufassirs among the Sahaba, the four Khalifas, especially Ali, a lot of his statements about tafsir have been transmitted. Abdullah bin Masud, also quite a lot. Ubay bin Ka'b, but of course, the major one is Ibn Abbas. And with regard to Ibn Abbas, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, it's reported that he prayed for Ibn Abbas. Allahumma faqihhu fi ad-din wa 'allimhu at-ta'wil. O Allah, grant him understanding of the deen and teach him the interpretation of the Qur'an. Now, Ibn Abbas had a lot of students. The most famous among them, Mujahid and Sa'id ibn Jubair and Ikrimah. You also have Ali ibn Abi Talha. And here we have to mention something. Sa'id ibn Jubair, you have, and Mujahid, you have lots of authentic isnads coming from them. Ikrimah also. And Ali ibn Abi Talha, there's some dispute about the authenticity, but al-Bukhari relied upon his transmissions of Ibn Abbas's tafsir very heavily in his Sahih, all by the same isnad, Muawiyah ibn Abi Salih, Abu Salih, the scribe of al-Layth, and then al-Bukhari, and there's some kind of break between somewhere in this chain, supposedly, but Ibn Hajar defends the authenticity of this chain. But two transmitters from Ibn Abbas, whenever you see their names in an attribution to him, know that attribution is weak. One is Ad-Dahhak, because it's pretty much established that he didn't meet Ibn Abbas. So anything he attributed to Ibn Abbas was through some intermediary, and that intermediary is unnamed. And the other is Al-Kalbi. He's a weak narrator. So whatever he attributes to Ibn Abbas is weak. Other scholars whose tafsir is mentioned, Aisha from time to time, Zayd ibn Thabit, of course, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, but these are less than those mentioned before. Now, one final issue, Ra'i, the final step after the linguistic, Qur'an by the Qur'an, Qur'an by the Sunnah, Qur'an by the statements of the Sahaba. You also have the statements of the Tabi'een, which, they're worthy of considering, but we're certainly not bound by them. And then the final step is discernment, or Ra'i, and it's more disparagingly referred to as opinion. And it has its place. I mean, there was a controversy about it in the early Islamic generations. And as part of this whole controversy that raged about, what is the place of the intellect and the reason with regard to revelation. And there were some people who wanted to exclude it entirely, and that was a losing position. The dominant position was that they both have a place, and but reason cannot just run roughshod over revelation. So there are various narrations that are attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They all have some kind of weaknesses in the isnad, but when you put them all together, maybe there's something there. But because it's such an ideologically fraught issue, there's also a lot of wariness with regard to these narrations. But anyway, you have hadiths like, I'll just read them in English to save time. Beware of attributing hadiths to me except for what you know. For whoever tells a lie against me knowingly should take his place in the fire. Okay, that's a very famous hadith that's narrated by many people as far as that goes. But then it goes on to say this particular version, which was collected by at-Tirmidhi, and whoever speaks about the Qur'an on the basis of his opinion should take his place in the fire. And then in Tirmidhi also, and Musnad of Imam Ahmad, whoever speaks about the Qur'an without knowledge should take his place in the fire. Now this is somewhat different from the earlier one. However, this narration has in it a narrator called Abdul A'la, who is a class 5 narrator in Ibn Hajar's scheme, which means Saduqun Yahim. He's truthful, but he has errors. And then a hadith that was reported by Tirmidhi again, but also by Abu Dawood. Whoever speaks about the Book of Allah, the Mighty and the Magnificent, from his opinion, and happens to be right, he has made a mistake. And in one narration, and if he's made a mistake, then he has faqad kafar, and he has disbelieved. Again, the narrator Suhail ibn Mahran is a weak narrator. And then let's say that these narrations are authentic. There were some responses to them that this is related, first explanation or first response, that this is related to explanation of the mutashabihat and the mushkil. Only clarification can come from the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, if there is such clarification. Another response that the person who is criticized here is somebody who explains a passage of the Quran to support a position that he holds, although he knows that it doesn't mean what he's trying to impose upon it. And then third, someone who looks at the apparent meaning of the words without bothering to do research as to what the Prophet ﷺ and the early scholars had to say about it. And are there missing words here? And what's called dalalatul iqtida, or is there a non-obvious order of the phrases called taqdeem and ta'khir, and considerations like that. Anyway, the bottom line is that tafsir bil ra'i definitely has its place in the spectrum of explanation of the Qur'an, but it comes at the end of those other steps, and it can't override that which is, certainly can't override the first three, which is linguistic meanings. So a tafsir which violates the meaning of the language is unacceptable. A tafsir which causes a verse, then your tafsir of it means that that verse now no longer is harmonious with other verses in the Quran, then that's clearly a mistake. It's deviant if you know what you're doing. Otherwise, it's deviant in the sense that you're meddling with something you have no business meddling with. And third, if your explanation, it smacks headlong into a hadith which is authentic and conflicts with the hadith's explanation of that verse, then your explanation would be unacceptable. With regard to the explanation of the Sahaba, I've already talked about some of the parameters there. So that's with regard to our time constraints, that's something, then some basic steps with the methodology of tafsir, and we'll talk in much greater detail about tafsir bil-ma'thur and tafsir bil-ra'i or bil-diraya later in another series of lessons, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.